This video is all about cool things you can do with some basic utilities in a modular synth. In particular, I want to explain how you can massively expand the sonic range of a basic oscillator with a few simple tricks. I'll show you a couple of ways to use sample and hold, both at audio rates for downsampling effects, and for more subtle humanising modulation. I'll explore using a rectifier to create octave-up copies of simple shapes. And to transform basic waveforms in more radical ways. I'll go into extreme PWM territory with a comparator. As well as using it for some pitch-dependent switching to spice up sequences. And I'll show you how you can use analog logic processing to turn a mono oscillator into a stereo one. Now, you might know some of these techniques already, but there might also be a few twists you haven't thought of, and hopefully at least some of them will inspire you to try new things in your own patching. For all these utility functions, I'll be using the new Worng Electronics Quiver, which packs a load of useful modulation and signal processing into 14 HP, but the stuff I'm going to cover here can be achieved with other gear too, of course. I should also say that this isn't a regular paid-for demo. I've been planning another utilities tutorial like this one on my channel for a while, and when Quiver came out, I realised I could use it to demonstrate a lot of the ideas on my list. So I asked Worng Electronics if they'd be up for me using it in this video, and they kindly sent one over. If you're not familiar with it, Quiver combines a set of related LFOs controlled via a macro knob at the top, a bit like the div kit in Instro Oct, plus a modulation cube that computes 6 CV outputs from 3 inputs. Then there's a wave folder, full wave rectifier, comparator, noise source, sample and hold, and analog logic block. There's some clever internal normaling, which means that with nothing patched you get interesting signals at every output, and you can self-patch it in lots of interesting ways and use it to process external signals too, as you'll see. Quiver really does too much for me to cover everything in a single video, so for this one I'm really going to focus on 4 of the utility processors around the edges. I'll go a bit deeper into the LFOs, modulation cube and wave folder in a separate video in a few weeks' time, where I'll use it at the heart of a big complex patch. There's quite a lot to get through today though, so let's crack on. So I want to start with a couple of ways to use sample and hold. Sample and hold basically lets you feed in an input signal, and then when you fire in a trigger, it will sample that input signal and hold the voltage of whatever that signal is at that point in time on the output. It's often used to create random voltages. We'll explore that in the second patch. But for the first patch, I want to use it to kind of create a digitally downsampled version of audio going into it. I'm going to feed in a sine wave from the Moo oscillator, which sounds like this. Just a nice clean sine, that's the green trace on data there. And I'm going to run it through the sample and hold in Quiver. That's down the bottom here, signal input's here, the white noise source is normal to that, and the output, the comparator, is normal to the trigger, but we're going to feed in our own external trigger from another oscillator, and we're going to feed the sine wave into the input and then listen to the output. So let's put the sine wave in. So we're going to come out of data's through into the input of the sample and hold, and we're going to take the square wave from the other oscillator in Moo to be our kind of sampling triggers, and then we can listen to the digitally downsampled version of that sine wave, which sounds like this. That's the blue trace on data, and you can see it's kind of a blocky square approximation of that sine wave. If I play with the frequency of the square, if I go higher, we kind of lose those artifacts and it gets more and more accurate. It's kind of sampling more often. This is like digitally increasing the sample rate. And if we go down, jumping down the octaves there, it kind of gets more and more square and broken. So let's go for something like this. And if I feed a pitch sequence to the sine wave, I'm tracking the same sequence on the square wave oscillator, so the kind of the shape is staying consistent no matter what frequency it's at. If we were to override that pitch information going to the square wave oscillator, it this as well. Just adding a little splash of reverb. But I really like this kind of digital square blocky version. And just to add a little bit more interest, I'm going to take a faster sequence and I'm going to sequence the octave jumps. On that sampling oscillator, so we're now getting these kind of changes within the note. So that plain sine wave with no harmonics whatsoever is now this quite dynamic, nicely glitchy, digital sounding kind of tone. One of the classic uses for sample and hold is for stepped random voltages. Basically, if you feed in a random source like noise, then every time you sample that noise, you'll get a different voltage held at the output. This is often used with a sort of fast clock to generate weird pitch effects or modulate filters, but I like to use it to modulate decay time on an envelope or envelope time in general, as well as things like filters in a slightly more subtle way. Can really add a bit of humanization to a patch. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a fairly straightforward subtractive voice with a 7-step sequence. It's just a saw wave from the moo going through the tri filter, and contour 1 is providing an envelope to the VCA and the filter. So far so ordinary. You'll hear every note has kind of got the same articulation, the same envelope. But if we take a copy of the clock that's driving the sequencer and go into the sample and hold sample input on Quiver, the white noise source is internally normal to the sample and hold signal input. And you can see this LED kind of flashing red and orange here. That's showing that every time this clock's hitting, it's sampling that noise and giving me a different value. Now I'm actually going to take that output and I'm going to use the rectifier in Quiver to make it unipolar. So basically any negative voltages will be flipped, inverted and turned positive. And if I just feed that into the blue trace on data, you'll just see this blue line move up and down, and that's the voltage basically changing on every note. You'll see it's kind of jumping up and down. And if I now take a couple of copies of that unipolar sample and hold random voltage, running them through Opal here, let's feed one into the rate CV input on contour 1, which is going to normal through to both sides. You notice I'm actually inverting it, so I'm basically pushing negative random voltage in here, which is going to elongate this envelope. You see straight away it kind of has the effect of kind of randomly accenting some notes, by making some longer. And I've got it quite exaggerated by kind of maxing this. In a real patch you might want to kind of make it a little bit more subtle. And I'm going to take a second copy of the same voltage and I'm going to push that into the filter CV input. So now when the envelope gets longer, the filter also opens more. So that really static kind of simple repetitive sequence is now getting these kind of dynamic accents happening randomly. And if we had a little bit of delay and reverb, that simple sequence is now much more interesting to listen to, I think. Okay, next I'm going to show you a couple of things you can do with a rectifier, and specifically a full wave rectifier, which is the kind that's in Quiver. You might also come across a half wave rectifier in Modular. That basically cuts off anything below 0 volts and just emits the positive portion of whatever's going in. What a full wave rectifier does is take anything negative, inverts it and makes it positive. It basically reflects it across the 0 line. So if you put in a bipolar wave like a triangle or a sine, you can end up with a wave that's got double the frequency, but with a sort of fully unipolar output. Let me show you what I mean. Here's a triangle wave from Moo going into data, the green trace, which sounds like this. That's going -5 to +5 volts, just your kind of standard oscillator. And if we run that through the full wave rectifier in Quiver, so I'll take that output, we'll go into the input. Rectifier is very simple over here on the left hand side, just got an input and an output. And we'll go into second channel on data, which is the blue trace. In fact, if I come out a second, that line is 0 volts. So relative to that, what happens? We now get a triangle which is an octave up, but with half the amplitude of the wave that's going in, because it's now running from 0 to +5 rather than -5 to +5. So if we want to turn that back into a full -5 to +5, there's a couple of ways to do it. You could use a gain doubler and an offset, and I can use bias 2 from Analogue for a really quick way to do this. So let's take the rectifier output into the bottom half of bias 2, which basically subtracts 5 volts and then multiplies it by 2. We'll take that into the top half of bias 2, which then adds 5 volts back on. You can do the maths at home, I'm not going to get too bogged down in it here, but the result of that is a -5 to +5 wave, which kind of matches the amplitude of the input, but is at exactly double the frequency, as you can see. So we can mix those two together. Let's just patch up a little mixer. I'm going to take a copy of that original triangle, and I'm going to take the output of the rectified version into there, and I'm going to take the output of this mixer into the red channel of data, and we'll listen to that. At the moment I've just turned up the green channel, which is now giving us a red triangle on the output, and we can bring in the octave-up version as well, and mix between the two to give us this more complex wave shape, which is a kind of mixture of the two octaves, or a kind of lead and sub-octave if you like. Let's patch in a little sequence, and let's just envelope that as well. And we can play with these two. So now the octave-up version is kind of our lead, and we've got a sub-oscillator effectively. And you could of course run these through VCAs and sweep them slowly like this to create these kind of effects. Add a little splash of reverb again. It's also quite nice to do it with a sine wave. You'll notice this is slightly different. It doesn't quite rectify in a symmetrical way because of the nature of a sine wave. So you end up with a shape that's not an exact sine, the octave-up version. If I just stop the sequence for a second, you can see the shape. It doesn't quite match. It's kind of got a sharper bottom and a rounded top. But that's quite interesting because it gives you a slightly different tone higher up. That's the pure sine going in. And this is a slightly more harmonically rich version coming out. So just with this rectifier we can add another layer to our oscillators at a different octave. And by mixing them like this we can create quite a nice little range of extra wave shapes. So we can build on the ideas of that previous patch and use a rectifier for some more extreme wave shaping effects by mixing an offset voltage with the waveform that we're pushing into the rectifier. Let's take a saw wave now from Moo, and that's running through Opal. So it's the green trace running through the Opal mixer, which is just that first channel fully open. Output of the mixer is going into the rectifier. Output of the rectifier is going through bias 2 again to bring it up to a kind of bipolar -5 to +5 range. And if we rectify a saw wave, you'll notice we get a triangle. But if we use one of the other channels of Opal to add some offset voltage, we can sort of push that back towards a saw shape. It'll kind of clip off at the top. And if we subtract voltage, same thing happens the other direction. So that's quite a cool wave shaper. We could envelope that for a kind of, almost like a kind of filtered effect. If we run a little sequence again, same sequence as the previous patch. So it's almost kind of enveloping from a sort of distorted saw to a triangle. I'm not using a VCA on the actual output, just this kind of wave shaping we're hearing with the envelope. So that's quite interesting. We could also use an LFO, say, to modulate that, to kind of sweep that, take the LFO out of Quiver. That's going to kind of push it up and down in voltage. Now, of course, this leads me to think about modulating at an audio rate. So let's take a sine wave from the other side of Moo and go in. this is in higher frequency, we get these quite interesting kind of very extreme wave shaping that we can control the depth of with the attenuator. Now it's a bit buzzy. We can kind of tune into a frequency that's roughly a factor of the root frequency going in, and this kind of slows down. Or we can sync that second oscillator to the first to kind of tidy this up. So let's take the square from channel 1 of movement and go into the hard sync input, and that kind of locks it. Now we get these quite interesting kind of sweeping sync effects. So we can control with this frequency these kind of shapes, and control the depth with the attenuator. And we can try different shapes. We could do triangle, spikier wave, do another saw, really rich, square. To sine, and we could try using an envelope to control the depth of this modulation, and we'll get the sequence running again. And now this envelope is controlling the depth of this modulation. Let's sweep that frequency with an LFO as well, because why not? So that saw wave is now pretty complex, and again, this is just a rectifier that's opening up this whole extra sonic palette for us. Okay, next up is the comparator. Now this is something that I think a lot of people find slightly intimidating. It's one of the most fundamental basic building blocks of synthesis, and all it really does is it takes two voltages, it compares them, and it puts out a high voltage if one is higher than the other. And one of the classic uses for a comparator is PWM. So in this first patch I'm going to show you a kind of turbocharged PWM using the comparator in Quiver. I've got a triangle wave going into one side of the comparator, and at the moment I've got a fixed offset voltage going into the other, and then the red trace at the bottom is what we're getting from the output of the comparator. So with a green triangle going in and a blue fixed offset at 0 volts, whenever the green is higher than the blue, whenever one side is higher voltage than the other, we're going to get a high output on the comparator output. So we'll get a square wave that sounds like this. And if I vary that voltage, the fixed offset, the blue line, if I turn that up, that square wave turns into a narrower pulse, because it's basically only high when the little tip of that green wave is above the blue line. And conversely, if I go down to towards -5, and it cuts out eventually. So me doing this manually, you'll notice, is the kind of classic PWM effect. We could of course patch in a sine wave, or a triangle wave LFO rather, to that. Just taking one of the LFO outputs from Quiver. So that's our kind of classic PWM effect. Really rich, classic synthesis kind of technique. We can get more extreme timbres if we modulate at audio rate. So let's take a sine output from Moo, say, and we're instantly into this much more gnarly, aggressive territory as we play with the tuning of this sine wave that's going in now. You'll see there are certain points where it kind of stops vibrating so much and kind of locks in. And we can stabilize it more using sync. We can sync this faster sine wave to the triangle wave. Now we get a more stable tone. If we start sweeping with an LFO, I've got an LFO patch to the FM input of this triangle oscillator. We can control the depth with this attenuator. just run a little pitch sequence in as well. So this is really a kind of very rich, very harmonically interesting kind of turbocharged PWM. Remember, this is just a triangle wave going into the comparator and a faster sine wave going to the other half, and we're getting these really complex kind of pulse width modulated tones coming out. Let's go even more wild. Let's take another sequence to the octave shift again of the second oscillator. So yeah, extreme as you like, really. Just that kind of basic classic PWM sound. So here's a slightly more subtle way to use a comparator. I'm going to use it to look at a pitch sequence CV, and when that pitch CV is over a certain amount, it's going to trigger something else in the patch. Let's get the sequence running. So I've deliberately sort of programmed the sequence with quite large pitch jumps. And that's the green trace, which is going to one side of the comparator, and the blue trace is my manual offset, which I've kind of maxed at the moment. Now, when I bring this threshold down, and it kind of activates the comparator, which will be the red line you'll see go up, when that comparator kicks in, it's going to fire a gate to this voltage-controlled switch, which is going to switch to a faster clock being sent to the envelope, which will basically give me ratcheting on steps above, with a voltage above that threshold. So let's bring this threshold down slightly. You see when it's now below these highest notes, we're getting a double hit. If I bring that down a bit further. Now more notes in the sequence are affected by that. And if I bring it all the way down, the sequence is always higher than this voltage, so we're always going to get this faster clock hitting the envelope generator. But it's quite a nice way of kind of dynamically changing the rhythm of a sequence based on the note pitch. You don't have to fire it into a switch to change the clocks. You could maybe throw to an effects send, or change the decay time on an envelope, or open a filter more, or some other kind of action. And I'm going to take a rectified triangle LFO from Quiver, just running through the rectifier so it's unipolar. And if we just pipe that in, we're going to get this sequence dynamically kind of changing as this LFO sweeps. So it's a really nice way to kind of subtly spice up the rhythms with these kind of pitch-dependent effects. Okay, finally I'm just going to take a little look at the analog logic block that's at the bottom right of Quiver. This has two inputs and two outputs. The maximum output puts out whatever is the higher of the two voltages at the inputs at any point in time, and the minimum puts out whatever's the lowest. You can use this kind of function to do some quite interesting stuff with LFOs and control voltages. I've covered that in a couple of previous videos on the channel. But for this patch I'm going to use it to create a stereo oscillator from a mono one. So I'm going to use one oscillator from Mumu. I'm going to take two different waveforms from that same oscillator, which are obviously going to be locked in tune and in phase with each other. They're going to go into the two inputs, and you can actually see that's the green and blue traces at the top and bottom here. I've got the triangle and the pulse wave. And then the max and min, which are the yellow and red traces in the middle, they're going to go through a stereo filter and a stereo VCA, and I'm going to pan them hard left and hard right. So let's just have a listen to the yellow signal, which is the kind of maximum of the triangle and the pulse that are coming in. And let's listen to the minimum signal, which is the red trace. And let's listen to them both together, panned hard left and right. So you hear that's, if you're listening on headphones or speakers, you'll get a kind of stereo effect from that. And we can animate this a bit by feeding an LFO to the pulse width. So I'm just going to feed in a bit of PWM, and now both of these waveforms are kind of changing shape. And again, if you're listening on headphones, this will be a lot more obvious. But those two simple input waves are now giving us this nice rich phase-locked stereo wave. So let's fire in a pitch sequence. And let's bring down the filter a bit. Let's add a bit of envelope to the filter. Let's add a bit of envelope to the VCA. I'm using the technique from earlier to randomly modulate with the sample and hold the envelope times. And I've got another slow LFO from Quiver, which I'm just going to use to modulate the filter a bit more as well. Let's just come down a bit further, add a bit of resonance. So yeah, I'll leave it there. That's basically just a little flavour of how you could use analog logic to stereofy a signal. Get these nice combo waves which are quite different from the inputs. And yeah, I hope you've enjoyed the video. I'll be back, like I say, with some more on Quiver, where I'm going to explore the modulation cube and the LFOs a bit more, and the wave folder, which I've not really touched on today either. But yeah, if you like the video, leave a like and a comment, subscribe to the channel if you're not already, and I'll be back soon with more stuff. So see you next time.